The widow's hands trembled as she counted the remaining sacks of grain in her barn, knowing that even with careful rationing, she might not survive until spring. Sarah Mitchell stood in the dim light filtering through the barn's weathered slats, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid Montana air. It was November of 1882, and the winter had already announced itself with an early snow that blanketed the territory in white. She had 23 sacks left. 23 sacks to feed herself, her 2 horses, and the handful of chickens that still laid eggs sporadically in weather this cold. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, taken by pneumonia in the spring, and she had been struggling to maintain their homestead ever since. She did the mathematics in her head for what felt like the 100th time. If she gave the horses half rations, they would weaken but might survive. If she gave the chickens almost nothing, relying on scraps from her own meager meals, perhaps half would make it. And for herself, well, she had grown accustomed to the hollow feeling in her stomach that never quite went away. She closed the barn door and fastened it securely, then trudged through the 6 inches of snow back to the small cabin she had once shared with Thomas. The town of Copper Ridge was 12 miles south, a hard ride in good weather, and nearly impossible once the heavy snows came. She had made the journey twice since Thomas died, once to file the necessary papers to keep the land in her name, and once to sell what few items she could spare for grain and supplies. The men in town had looked at her with a mixture of pity and speculation. A woman alone on a homestead rarely stayed that way for long, either remarrying out of necessity or abandoning the land altogether. Sarah had no intention of doing either. Thomas had loved this land, had broken his back clearing rocks and building fences, and she would honor his memory by keeping it. Inside the cabin, she built up the fire in the cast iron stove and put on water for coffee. She allowed herself 1 cup in the morning and 1 in the evening. The beans stretched as far as they would go. The cabin was small but well built. Thomas had seen to that. 1 main room that served as kitchen and living area, and a smaller bedroom where their beds still sat with the quilt his mother had made them as a wedding present. Sarah was 24 years old and felt ancient. She had been rationing the grain for 3 weeks now, ever since she realized that her calculations for winter had been overly optimistic. Thomas had always handled the planning for such things, and she had discovered too late that she had underestimated how much the animals would need. Every morning she measured out portions with painstaking care. Every evening she did the same, and every night she lay awake worrying that it would not be enough. The sound of hoofbeats in the snow startled her from her thoughts. Sarah moved quickly to the window, her heart racing. Visitors were rare, and not always welcome. A lone woman was vulnerable in ways that kept her awake at night. But as she peered through the frost-covered glass, she recognized the rider. It was the cowboy from the Triple Creek Ranch, the one who had helped her when her wagon wheel broke outside of town 6 weeks ago. He was a tall man, lean and broad-shouldered, in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle. She did not know his name, only that he worked for Walter Brennan, who owned the largest cattle operation in the territory. He had been courteous and efficient when he helped her, refusing her thanks with a quiet nod, and she had thought little of it beyond being grateful for his assistance. Now he was here, at her homestead, and she could not imagine why. Sarah wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and opened the cabin door as he dismounted. He was leading a pack mule, she noticed, laden with bulging sacks. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the winter light, and his face was weathered from years of sun and wind. She guessed he was perhaps 27 or 28, though it was hard to tell with cowboys. The life aged them. "Sir," she replied, her voice cautious. "Can I help you?" "Name's Jacob Reese, ma'am. We met a while back when your wagon had trouble." His voice was low and steady, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or maybe Oklahoma. "I have some grain here. Wondered if I might store it in your barn." Sarah blinked, confused. "Store it? I do not understand." Jacob shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable. "The ranch barn's full up, and Mr. Brennan's got more grain coming in than we have space for. He asked me to find some place to keep the overflow. I remembered you had a barn, thought you might have room." It was a lie. Sarah knew it was a lie, even as he said it, though she could not fathom why he was telling it. The Triple Creek Ranch had multiple barns, and Walter Brennan was not a man who ran out of storage space. But Jacob Reese was standing in her yard with a mule loaded with grain sacks, and the winter was long, and she was desperate. "How much grain?" she asked carefully. Got about 40 sacks here. There would be more coming, maybe another 60 or so over the next few days. He met her eyes steadily, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. He knew. Somehow, he knew about her situation. Pride warred with necessity in Sarah's chest. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him that she did not need charity, that she could manage on her own. But the hollow feeling in her stomach and the knowledge of those 23 sacks in her barn made the words die in her throat. "I have room," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded and began unloading the mule without another word. Sarah watched him for a moment, then moved to help. He glanced at her but did not protest, and together they carried the heavy sacks into the barn. He was stronger than she was, hoisting 2 sacks to her one, but he did not make her feel weak or incapable. They worked in silence, their breath steaming in the cold air. When the mule was unloaded, Jacob checked the fastenings on her barn door and frowned. "This latch is loose," he said. "You mind if I fix it?" "You do not need to do that," Sarah protested. "Won't take but a minute." He was already pulling tools from his saddlebag, and Sarah found herself stepping back, letting him work. He tightened the screws and replaced one that had rusted through, testing the latch several times until he was satisfied. "There, should hold better now." "Thank you," Sarah said. The words felt inadequate. Jacob mounted his horse, the mule's lead rope in his hand. "I will be back in a few days with the rest," he said. "If that is all right with you, ma'am." "Yes," Sarah heard herself say. "Yes, that would be fine." He touched his hat brim again and rode off, the mule plodding behind him. Sarah stood in the snow and watched him go until he disappeared over the rise. Then she went back into the barn and counted the new sacks. 40. Added to her 23, that was 63, and he had said there would be more coming. She sat down on a hay bale and put her face in her hands, and for the first time since Thomas died, she cried not from grief, but from overwhelming relief. 3 days later, Jacob returned. Sarah had been watching for him, though she told herself she was not. This time he had 2 mules, both heavily loaded. He greeted her with the same quiet courtesy and began unloading without waiting for permission. Sarah came out to help, and again they worked in silence. The rhythm of it felt almost companionable, the lift and carry and stack becoming a kind of wordless conversation. "Your roof has some shingles loose," Jacob said, as they finished with the second mule. "On the cabin, could let water in come the spring thaw." "I know," Sarah admitted. "I meant to fix them, but I cannot quite reach, and the ladder is not stable enough." "I could take a look at it if you like." Sarah hesitated. Accepting the grain was one thing, though she still did not fully understand why he was offering it under such a transparent pretense. But allowing him to do repairs on her home felt like crossing some invisible line. Yet, what choice did she have? If the roof leaked, she could lose her supplies, her bed, everything she owned. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I would be grateful," she said. Jacob spent the next hour on her roof, while Sarah held the ladder steady. He replaced several shingles and secured others, his movements efficient and sure. When he climbed down, his hands were red with cold, and Sarah found herself saying, "I have coffee. It is not much, but you are welcome to a cup, to warm you before you ride back." Something shifted in his expression, a slight softening around the eyes. "That would be kind of you, ma'am." They sat at her small table, the coffee steaming between them. Sarah had not entertained anyone in the cabin since Thomas died, and the presence of another person made the space feel different, both smaller and warmer. Jacob wrapped his hands around the tin cup and drank gratefully. "This is good coffee," he said. "Thank you. It is my last pound. I am making it last." She said it without thinking, then bit her lip. She had not meant to reveal more of her circumstances. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "I want you to know that the grain in your barn, it is yours, however you need to use it. For your animals, for yourself, if you need to grind some for flour, however you need it." Sarah's hands tightened on her own cup. "That is not what you said before. You said you needed storage space." "I know what I said." Jacob met her eyes steadily. "And I am saying something different now. The grain is yours. No one will come asking for it back." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. I cannot pay you. I have nothing to give in return." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and sincere. My mother was widowed when I was 12 years old. My father died in a cattle drive accident, drowned in a river crossing. She tried to keep our farm going, but people did not help the way they should have. She was too proud to ask, and folks were too busy with their own troubles to notice. We lost the farm, spent 2 years barely surviving before my uncle finally came and took us in. I swore then that if I ever saw a woman in a similar situation, I would not look away. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. I am trying to manage, she said quietly. I am trying to honor what my husband built here. I can see that, Jacob said, and you are doing a fine job. But everyone needs help sometimes. That does not make you weak or a failure. It just makes you human. They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the stove and the coffee creating a small bubble of comfort against the cold world outside. Sarah studied Jacob's face when she thought he was not looking. He had strong features, a straight nose, and a firm jaw, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years of squinting into the sun. His hands were calloused and scarred from hard work, but he held the tin cup gently, as if he were used to being careful with fragile things. "Where is your mother now?" Sarah asked. "She died 5 years ago. Fever took her. But she had some good years with my uncle and his family. My younger sisters are both married now, living in Kansas. They are doing well." He paused. "I am glad I could help them. Wish I could have done more." "You were just a boy when your father died," Sarah said softly. "You should not carry that burden." Jacob smiled, but it was a sad expression. "We all carry something, I suppose." When Jacob finally left that afternoon, Sarah stood at the window and watched him ride away. There was something about him that made her feel less alone, and that feeling was both comforting and terrifying. She had loved Thomas deeply, and his death had left a hole in her life that she had assumed would never be filled. The thought of feeling anything for another man seemed like a betrayal. Yet she could not deny that Jacob Riis had stirred something in her, some long dormant awareness that she was still alive, still capable of feeling things beyond grief and worry. Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob came 3 more times. Each time he brought more grain, along with other supplies, a sack of flour, coffee beans, sugar, a side of bacon wrapped in cloth. He never mentioned these additions, simply included them with the grain sacks as if they were part of the same delivery. Sarah stopped protesting. She knew what he was doing, and he knew that she knew, and there seemed to be an understanding between them that did not require words. He also continued to find things that needed repair. A fence post that had worked loose, the door to the chicken coop that did not close properly, the pump handle that stuck in the cold. Sarah watched him work and sometimes helped, handing him tools or holding boards steady while he hammered. They talked more easily now, the initial awkwardness fading into something more comfortable. She learned that Jacob had been working on the Triple Creek Ranch for 6 years, since he was 22. Before that, he had worked on various spreads across the territories, learning his trade and sending money back to his mother and sisters. He was a skilled horseman and had a reputation for being good with difficult animals. He could track anything across any terrain, and he knew how to survive in country that killed unprepared men. Walter Brennan valued him highly and paid him well by cowboy standards. Sarah told him about her life with Thomas, how they had met in St. Louis, where her father had owned a dry goods store. Thomas had come in to buy supplies before heading west, and they had fallen into conversation. He had courted her for 3 months before proposing, and she had shocked her family by accepting. They had been married for 4 years before he died. 4 years of hard work and harder winters, but also of laughter and love and plans for the future. She told Jacob these things hesitantly at first, then more freely, and he listened without interruption, his dark eyes attentive and kind. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing heavy snows and temperatures that plunged below zero. Sarah kept her animals alive with the grain Jacob had brought, and she kept herself alive with the food supplies he had quietly provided. She thought of him often during the long evenings alone in the cabin, wondered if he was warm enough in the bunkhouse at the ranch, if he thought of her the way she was beginning to think of him. Just before Christmas, Jacob rode up to the cabin, leading a pack horses laden with fresh meat. Sarah came out to meet him, and he gave her his usual polite nod. "Mr. Brennan had a steer slaughtered," he said, "sent some of the meat around to folks who might need it." Sarah looked at the wrapped bundles and then at Jacob's face. "Did he?" she asked quietly. Jacob had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Well, he agreed to it when I suggested it. And I suppose he suggested I specifically should receive some?" I might have mentioned that your cold cellar probably had room for storage. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. You are a terrible liar, Jacob Reese. Yes, ma'am, I have been told that before. He was smiling too, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. Will you let me hang this meat in your cellar, or are you going to send me back to explain to Mr. Brennan why his generous gift was refused? I suppose I have no choice, Sarah said, but her tone was warm. It would be rude to refuse such generosity. They hung the meat in her cold cellar, and Sarah marveled at the abundance of it. There was enough here to last her through the entire winter with some to spare. When they climbed back up into the cabin, she made coffee and brought out a loaf of bread she had baked that morning. Stay for a meal, she said. It was not quite a question. Jacob looked at her, and something passed between them that made Sarah's heart beat faster. I would like that very much, he said. They ate together at the small table, the food simple but plentiful. Sarah had made bean soup earlier in the week, and she heated it up along with the fresh bread. It was the best meal she had eaten in months, made better by the company. Jacob complimented her cooking, and she found herself laughing at something he said, a real laugh that felt strange and wonderful after so many months of silence. After the meal, Jacob helped her clean up, insisting despite her protests. They stood side by side at her small counter, washing and drying the dishes, and Sarah was acutely aware of his presence beside her. He was tall enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and the warmth of him in the small space seemed to fill the cabin. Sarah, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. Her heart stuttered at the sound of it. I need to tell you something. She set down the dish she was drying and turned to face him. What is it? Jacob took a breath, and she could see that he was nervous, this confident cowboy who seemed unafraid of anything. I did not come here just because you needed help, he said. I mean, that is why I came the first time. I heard in town that Thomas Mitchell's widow was trying to manage the homestead alone, and I remembered helping you with the wagon, and I thought I should check on you. But I kept coming back because I wanted to, because I found myself thinking about you all the time, because I have not been able to get you out of my mind since the day I met you. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Jacob, I know it has not been long since your husband passed, Jacob continued, the words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them out. And I know you must still be grieving. I am not asking you for anything, Sarah. I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand that my help comes with no expectations, but it also comes from a place of real feeling. I care about you. I care about whether you are warm and fed and safe. I care about whether you are happy, and I will keep caring about those things, whether you can return my feelings or not. Sarah stood very still, her mind racing. She had known, on some level, that there was something between them, the way he looked at her, the way she caught herself watching for him, the warmth that spread through her chest when she heard his horse approaching, but hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. I loved my husband, she said quietly. I loved Thomas with everything I had. I know, Jacob said. I can see it in the way you talk about him, in the way you were fighting to keep this place that mattered to him. I would never ask you to forget him or to stop loving him. But I find myself thinking about you too, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I find myself listening for the sound of your horse. I find myself looking forward to your visits in a way that makes me feel guilty and glad at the same time. I do not know what to do with these feelings, Jacob. I do not know if I am ready for them. Jacob reached out slowly and took her hand in his. His palm was rough and warm, and Sarah felt the contact all the way through her body. You do not have to do anything with them right now, he said gently. You do not have to be ready. I just wanted you to know that I am here, and I will keep being here for as long as you need me, or want me. They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped in the warm cabin, while the wind howled outside. Sarah looked at their joined hands and then up at Jacob's face, at the honesty and vulnerability she saw there. This man had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. He had helped her without asking for anything in return, had listened to her stories about her dead husband without jealousy or impatience, had been patient and gentle and good. Stay a while longer, she said. Please, I do not want to be alone tonight. Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, but his voice remained steady. I will stay as long as you want me to. We can just talk, or sit by the fire. Whatever you need. They settled into the two chairs by the stove, the fire crackling between them. Sarah found herself telling him more about her life, about growing up in St. Louis, about her parents who had died in a cholera outbreak when she was 20, about how Thomas had been her refuge from that grief. Jacob told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the day he left home to find work so he could support his family. They talked until the fire burned low, and then Jacob built it back up, and they talked some more. At some point, Sarah dozed off in her chair, exhausted from the emotion of the evening. She woke to find a blanket draped over her, and Jacob asleep in the other chair, his arms crossed over his chest, and his hat tipped forward over his eyes. The sight of him there, keeping watch over her even in sleep, made her throat tight with emotion. She stood quietly and moved to the bedroom, then paused at the door. "Jacob," she called softly. He woke instantly, sitting up straight. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine, but you should sleep in the bed. You will be miserable trying to spend the night in that chair." Jacob shook his head. "I could not take your bed, Sarah. I am fine here." "Then we will both use it," Sarah said, and saw his eyes widen. "There is room for 2 people to sleep without impropriety. It is too cold for you to ride back tonight anyway, and that chair will leave you aching for a week. Come on, we are both adults, and we can both behave appropriately." Jacob hesitated, then stood slowly. "If you are sure." "I am sure." They lay down on opposite sides of the bed, fully clothed, with a careful space between them. Sarah could feel the warmth radiating from Jacob's body, could hear his breathing in the darkness. It felt strange to share the bed she had shared with Thomas, but it also felt right in a way she had not expected. She was not ready to move forward, not fully, but she was no longer content to stay frozen in the past either. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, "for everything." "You do not need to thank me," Jacob whispered back. "Get some sleep, Sarah." She drifted off to the sound of his breathing, and for the first time in months, she slept deeply and without nightmares. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a disoriented moment, she thought Thomas was alive again, that the past 8 months had been a terrible dream. Then reality settled back into place, and she remembered. Jacob. Jacob was here, and he was apparently cooking breakfast. She rose and went into the main room to find him at the stove, tending a pan with the ease of a man accustomed to cooking for himself. He looked up when she entered and smiled. "Morning. Hope you do not mind. I figured since you fed me dinner, I could manage breakfast." "I do not mind," Sarah said, moving to join him. The domesticity of the scene made her chest ache with a complex mixture of emotions. It felt both like a betrayal of Thomas and like a glimpse of something she had thought she would never have again. They ate together, and then Jacob reluctantly prepared to leave. "I should get back to the ranch. Mr. Brennan will be wondering where I got to." "Will you be in trouble for staying away overnight?" Sarah asked, concerned. Jacob shrugged. "Probably not. Walter is a fair man. But I do have work to do, and I have been neglecting it to come here." Guilt washed through Sarah. "I did not mean to cause you problems with your employment." "You did not cause anything," Jacob said firmly. He took her hand again, that same gentle clasp that made her feel safe and unsettled all at once. "I will be back in a few days, sooner if you need anything. If there is trouble, or you need help with anything at all, you ride to the Triple Creek Ranch and ask for me. Do you understand? Day or night, you ask for me." "I will," Sarah promised. She watched him ride away, and the cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. The next few days passed slowly. Sarah tended her animals, rationed her supplies, with much less anxiety now that the barn was well stocked, and tried not to count the hours until Jacob might return. She was a widow in mourning, she reminded herself. She should not be eager for the attention of another man. But her heart seemed not to care what she should or should not feel. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Sarah attended the service at the small church in Copper Ridge, making the long, cold ride because she felt she should maintain some connection to the community. Several people spoke to her, offering holiday wishes and asking how she was managing. She could see the speculation in their eyes, particularly among the older women. A young widow was always a subject of interest, and Sarah knew that her presence at the church was being noted and would be discussed. She was surprised when Rachel Carson, the doctor's wife, approached her after the service. Rachel was a few years older than Sarah, a capable woman who assisted her husband in his practice and was known for her no-nonsense approach to life. "Mrs. Mitchell," Rachel said warmly, "it is good to see you. How are you managing out at the homestead?" "Well enough, thank you," Sarah replied cautiously. Rachel glanced around to make sure they were not overheard, then leaned in slightly. "I heard that Jacob Reese from the Triple Creek has been helping you with some repairs and such." Sarah stiffened, defensive. "He has been kind enough to assist with some things I cannot manage on my own." "I think that is wonderful," Rachel said, and her tone was genuine. "Jacob is a good man, one of the best I have met in this territory. If he has taken an interest in your welfare, you are fortunate. Do not let the gossips make you feel ashamed of accepting help. You are doing what you need to do to survive, and there is no shame in that." Sarah felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "We women have to support each other out here," Rachel said. "The men might do the heavy lifting, but we are the ones who keep everything from falling apart. If you need anything at all, you come find me. My husband and I live above his office on Main Street. You are always welcome." The kindness in Rachel's words sustained Sarah through the ride home and the lonely evening that followed. She was not completely alone, she realized. There were people who wished her well, who would help her if she needed it. The thought was comforting as she settled down to sleep in her empty cabin. Jacob returned 2 days after Christmas. He looked tired, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Rough few days at the ranch," he explained when Sarah commented on his appearance. "Lost some cattle in the cold. Had to ride out and bring in what we could save." "You should rest," Sarah said, ushering him inside. "Sit by the fire. I will make coffee." "I am all right," Jacob protested, but he sank into the chair with obvious relief. Sarah made the coffee and brought him a cup, along with some of the bread she had baked that morning. She watched him eat and drink, noting the way his shoulders gradually relaxed, the way some of the tension left his face. She was struck by how comfortable she felt caring for him, how natural it seemed to anticipate his needs. "I have been thinking," Jacob said after a while, "about what I said before, about my feelings for you." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "Yes? I do not want to push you into anything," Jacob continued, "but I also do not want to be dishonest about what I am hoping for. I would like to court you, Sarah, properly, with the intention of marriage, if you find that you could care for me the way I care for you." Sarah set down her cup with trembling hands. "Jacob, I know it is soon," he said quickly. "I know you need time, but I am not a rich man, Sarah. I cannot afford to support 2 households. If we are going to move forward, I need to know that there is a possibility of a future. I am not asking you to decide right now. I am just asking if you are willing to try, to see if what is between us could grow into something lasting." Sarah closed her eyes, torn between her lingering grief for Thomas and her growing feelings for Jacob. She thought about the long, lonely winter ahead, about all the winters to come if she chose to remain alone. She thought about the way Jacob made her feel safe and cared for, the way his presence filled the empty spaces in her cabin and in her heart. She thought about Thomas and what he would want for her, and she knew with sudden certainty that he would not want her to spend the rest of her life grieving. "Yes," she said, opening her eyes to meet Jacob's gaze. "Yes, I am willing to try." The smile that broke across Jacob's face was like sunrise after a long night. He stood and crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. "You will not regret this," he promised. "I will do everything I can to make you happy, Sarah. I swear it." "I know," she said softly. "I trust you, Jacob. I would not have said yes if I did not." He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "May I come calling on Sunday?" he asked. "Properly, the way a courting man should?" "You may," Sarah said, and felt her own smile forming. "I will make dinner." Jacob left soon after, but the cabin no longer felt empty. Sarah moved through her evening chores with a lightness she had not felt in months. She was allowing herself to hope again, to imagine a future that held more than just survival. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. True to his word, Jacob came calling the following Sunday. He arrived in the early afternoon, washed and shaved, and wearing what were clearly his best clothes. He brought flowers, winter wildflowers that he must have searched hard to find, and the gesture touched Sarah deeply. They spent the afternoon together, talking and laughing, and Sarah cooked the dinner she had promised. It felt like a date, like the early days of her courtship with Thomas. But it was also different. She was different now, older and more worn by life. And Jacob was not Thomas. He was his own person, with his own way of looking at the world, and Sarah found herself appreciating those differences rather than resenting them. As the weeks passed and January gave way to February, Jacob came calling every Sunday, and sometimes during the week as well, when his work allowed. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their hopes and fears and dreams. Jacob told her about his plan to one day have his own ranch, something small but his own. Sarah told him about her desire to one day have children, to fill the cabin with life and laughter the way she and Thomas had planned. "I would like that too," Jacob said when she mentioned children. "I would like a family. I would like to give my children the stability I did not have growing up." They were sitting close together by the fire, and Sarah found herself leaning into his warmth. "How many children would you want?" "As many as we are blessed with," Jacob said, "though I admit the thought of being a father is both exciting and terrifying." "You would be a good father," Sarah said with certainty. "You are patient and kind. Those are the most important qualities." Jacob put his arm around her shoulders, and Sarah let herself relax against him. They had been careful about physical affection, both aware of the proprieties and the need to move slowly, but small touches had become more common. A hand on the arm, a brush of fingers, and now this, sitting together with his arm around her. It felt right. It felt like coming home. In late February, a warm spell broke the back of the winter cold. The snow began to melt, and there were days when the sun actually felt warm on Sarah's face. Jacob came to help her assess what repairs would be needed once spring fully arrived, and they walked the property together, making lists and plans. "The east fence line needs work," Jacob observed, "and you will want to plant a garden come April. Have you thought about what you might grow?" "Potatoes, certainly," Sarah said. "Beans, squash, carrots. Whatever will grow well and keep through the winter. I am not confident in my farming abilities, but I am willing to learn." "I can help with that," Jacob said. "I am no expert, but I know the basics. We can figure it out together." "We?" The words settled into Sarah's heart with a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sun. Jacob was talking about the future, as if he would be part of it, as if her struggles and successes were his as well. She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Jacob, I need to tell you something." He looked at her attentively, patient as always. "What is it?" "I am ready," she said simply. "I am ready to move forward, with you, fully and completely." Jacob's eyes searched her face. "You are sure?" "Sarah, I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured." "I am sure," she said firmly. "I will always love Thomas. He will always be part of my history, part of who I am. But he is my past, Jacob. You are my future. If you still want that, if you still want me." "Want you?" Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. "Sarah, I have wanted you since the moment I saw you struggling with that wagon wheel, trying so hard to be strong and capable, even though you were clearly exhausted and at the end of your rope. I have wanted you every day since. I will want you every day for the rest of my life." He pulled her into his arms, and Sarah went willingly, wrapping her own arms around his waist and holding tight. They stood like that for a long moment, and then Jacob tilted her face up and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, and Sarah felt it all the way to her toes. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Marry me," Jacob said. "Not someday in the future, but soon. As soon as we can arrange it. Marry me, Sarah, and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you." They told Walter Brennan first, since Jacob worked for him and would need to make arrangements. Walter was a gruff man in his 50s, but he had a kind heart underneath the rough exterior. He congratulated them both and offered Jacob a better position on the ranch, one with higher pay and a small house that came with it. "You will need a proper place to start your married life," Walter said. "The old foreman's house is sitting empty. It is not much, but it is sound. You can live there rent-free, and I will give you Sundays off to work on the Mitchell place until you decide what you want to do long-term." Jacob was stunned by the generosity. "Mr. Brennan, I do not know what to say." "Say you will keep being the best hand I have got and that you will be happy," Walter replied. "That is all the thanks I need." They were married in early March in the small church in Copper Ridge. Rachel Carson stood up as Sarah's witness, and one of Jacob's fellow ranch hands stood up for him. It was a simple ceremony, with no fancy trappings, but Sarah had never felt more certain of anything in her life. When Jacob slipped the simple gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for all his days, she believed him completely. The wedding supper was held at the hotel in town, paid for by Walter Brennan as a gift to his employee. Most of the Triple Creek Ranch hands attended, along with several townspeople who had known Thomas and wanted to wish Sarah well in her new life. Dr. Carson gave a toast that made everyone laugh, and Rachel hugged Sarah tightly and whispered, "Be happy. You deserve it." Jacob took Sarah back to the Mitchell homestead that night, rather than to the foreman's house at the ranch. "This is where we started," he said. "This is where I first knew I was falling in love with you. It seems right to spend our wedding night here." The cabin was warm and welcoming, and Sarah had prepared for this night with care. Fresh linens on the bed, a fire burning in the stove, candles lit on the table. Jacob looked around and then at her, his eyes dark with emotion. "I love you, Sarah Reese," he said. "I will never stop being grateful that you let me into your life." "I love you too," Sarah replied, and realized that it was completely true. She loved this man who had shown her such kindness, who had helped her without asking for anything in return, who had been patient with her grief and gentle with her heart. "I love you, Jacob." They came together with a tenderness that made Sarah's eyes sting with happy tears. Jacob was careful and attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and Sarah gave herself over to the experience completely. It was different from being with Thomas, but it was beautiful in its own way. When they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, both of them sated and drowsy, Sarah felt a peace settle over her that she had not known was possible. "Are you all right?" Jacob asked, stroking her hair. "I am more than all right," Sarah said. "I am happy." They spent 3 days at the homestead, which Walter had granted Jacob as a brief honeymoon. They made love and talked and made plans for the future. They walked the property and discussed what improvements they would make, how they would balance working the homestead with Jacob's responsibilities at the ranch. They cooked together and ate together and fell asleep in each other's arms, and Sarah felt her heart healing in ways she had not thought possible. On the 4th day, they moved to the foreman's house at the Triple Creek Ranch. It was indeed small, just 3 rooms, but it was well built and comfortable. Sarah set about making it a home, hanging curtains and arranging furniture, while Jacob returned to his work with the cattle. They settled into a routine, Jacob working long days at the ranch while Sarah tended the house and began planning for the garden she would plant at both properties. Every Sunday, they went to the homestead together. Jacob made repairs and improvements while Sarah worked on the cabin and tended the animals they had moved there. The barn was still full of the grain Jacob had brought, and Sarah used it to feed the livestock and to grind into flour for baking. She never forgot that Jacob had saved her life with that grain, had seen her need, and met it without asking for anything in return. That generosity had been the foundation of their love, and she cherished it. Spring arrived fully in April, bringing wildflowers and green grass and the promise of new life. Sarah planted gardens at both properties, and Jacob helped her, the two of them working side by side in the warm sun. Sarah found that she had a knack for growing things, and the plants flourished under her care. By May, they were eating fresh vegetables, and Sarah was canning extras for the winter to come. In June, Sarah realized her monthly courses were late. At first, she thought nothing of it, but when they did not come and her breasts began to feel tender, she allowed herself to hope. She waited until she was certain before telling Jacob, wanting to be sure before raising his expectations. One evening in early July, as they sat on the porch of the foreman's house watching the sunset, Sarah took Jacob's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said quietly. Jacob's head whipped around to stare at her, his eyes wide. "Sarah, are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I think the baby will come in February." Jacob let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. "We are having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Sarah, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy? I am the happiest man in Montana," Jacob declared. He dropped to his knees and pressed his face to her stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Sarah stroked his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was not the life she had planned when she married Thomas and came west. But it was a good life, perhaps even a better life than she had imagined. She had survived loss and loneliness and near starvation, and she had come through it stronger. She had found love again when she thought it was impossible, and now she was going to bring new life into the world. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Sarah continued to work in the gardens and tend the house, though Jacob became increasingly protective as she began to show. He insisted she rest more, and he took over the heavier chores without being asked. Walter Brennan was understanding about Jacob taking time to care for his pregnant wife, and the other ranch hands pitched in to cover when Jacob needed to be with Sarah. In December, as the first real snows began to fall, Sarah stood in the barn at the homestead and looked at the grain stores. They had more than enough to last the winter, both from the supplies Jacob had brought the previous year and from their own successful harvest. She would never again face the desperation of rationing grain and wondering if she would starve. Jacob had seen to that, and she loved him all the more for it. Christmas that year was a celebration. They invited Rachel and Dr. Carson to dinner at the foreman's house, along with several of Jacob's friends from the ranch. Sarah cooked a feast, and the small house was filled with laughter and warmth. She looked around at the faces of people who had become her friends and family, and she felt blessed beyond measure. "This is the best Christmas I have ever had," she told Jacob that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her swollen belly. "This is just the beginning," Jacob promised. "Every year will be better than the last." In late February, Sarah went into labor. Jacob rode frantically to fetch Dr. Carson and Rachel, then paced outside the bedroom while the doctor and Rachel attended to his wife. The labor was long and difficult, and Jacob aged years in those hours, listening to Sarah's cries and feeling utterly helpless. But finally, as dawn broke over the ranch, a baby's cry filled the air. Rachel emerged from the bedroom, exhausted but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy, beautiful son, and Sarah is doing well." Jacob burst into the bedroom to find Sarah propped up against the pillows, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Her face was pale and drawn, but she was smiling. "Jacob, come meet your son." Jacob approached on trembling legs and looked down at the baby. He had a shock of dark hair and a red wrinkled face, and he was the most beautiful thing Jacob had ever seen. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered. "We should name him," Sarah said. "I was thinking perhaps Thomas, after my first husband, to honor his memory." Jacob considered this, then shook his head gently. "I think we should name him something that is ours," he said. "Something that represents our future, not our past. What about Samuel Reese? It is a strong name." Sarah smiled. "Samuel, I like that. Samuel Thomas Reese, perhaps, so he carries both names." "Samuel Thomas Reese," Jacob repeated. "Perfect." Little Samuel proved to be a good baby, healthy and hungry, and growing quickly. Sarah recovered well from the birth, and soon she was back to her regular activities, though she now did them with a baby on her hip or sleeping nearby. Jacob was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, marveling at every milestone, no matter how small. As Samuel grew through his first year, Jacob and Sarah made a decision about their future. The homestead would be kept and maintained, but they would live primarily at the foreman's house on the Triple Creek Ranch. The arrangement worked well, giving them the stability of Jacob's employment while still maintaining the land that Sarah had fought so hard to keep. When Samuel was 2 years old, Sarah became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in the spring of Samuel's 3rd year, they welcomed a daughter they named Emma. She had Sarah's fair hair and Jacob's dark eyes, and Samuel was instantly smitten with his baby sister. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Jacob rose through the ranks at the Triple Creek Ranch, eventually becoming the foreman when the previous one retired. The promotion came with a larger house, and the growing Reese family moved gratefully into the extra space. Sarah balanced caring for the children with maintaining both households and helping with ranch responsibilities when needed. She became known in the community as a capable, kind woman, and she and Rachel Carson became close friends. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Samuel started school in the one-room schoolhouse in Copper Ridge. Emma took her first steps and spoke her first words. Sarah and Jacob celebrated anniversaries and birthdays and ordinary days that were special simply because they were spent together. The homestead remained a retreat for the family, a place they went on Sundays and holidays, where the children could run free and Jacob and Sarah could remember how they had started. When Samuel was 7 and Emma was 4, Sarah became pregnant for a third time. She was in her early 30s now, and this pregnancy was harder than the previous two. Jacob worried constantly, hovering over her until she laughingly told him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. But she was secretly grateful for his concern, and she rested more than she had with the previous pregnancies, letting her body tell her what it needed. This third child, another son they named Henry, arrived a few weeks early but healthy. He was a loud, energetic baby who kept them all on their toes. Samuel and Emma adored their baby brother, competing for the chance to help care for him. As Henry grew, the Reese family became a fixture in the Copper Ridge community. Jacob was respected as a fair and capable foreman. Sarah was known for her kindness and her delicious cooking, and the children were well behaved and loved. Walter Brennan, who had never married, treated the Reese children like his own grandchildren, and he continued to support Jacob's career and the family's welfare. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob took Sarah back to the homestead cabin, where they had spent their wedding night. The children were staying with Rachel and Dr. Carson for the evening, and Jacob and Sarah had the place to themselves. They walked the property hand in hand, remembering that first winter when everything had seemed so desperate and uncertain. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked as they stood looking at the barn that had once held precious few sacks of grain. "Marrying me instead of finding someone else? Someone who could have given you more?" Sarah turned to face him, cupping his face in her hands. "Jacob Reese, you have given me everything. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again. You gave me 3 beautiful children and a life full of joy and purpose. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I just want you to be happy," Jacob said softly. "That is all I have ever wanted." "I am happy," Sarah said firmly. "I am happier than I ever imagined I could be. I love you, Jacob. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They made love in the cabin that night, with the tenderness and passion of two people who had built a life together, who knew each other's bodies and hearts as well as their own. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the bed where their marriage had begun, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in 10 years. The frightened, desperate widow she had been was gone, replaced by a confident woman who knew her own worth and strength. And Jacob, the quiet cowboy who had filled her barn without asking why, had become the center of her world, her partner in all things, the father of her children, and the love of her life. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new joys. Samuel grew into a serious young man who loved working with horses like his father. Emma proved to have a talent for healing, and often accompanied Dr. Carson on his rounds, learning the trade. Henry was the wild one, always getting into trouble and making everyone laugh with his antics. Walter Brennan passed away when Henry was 10, leaving the Triple Creek Ranch to Jacob in his will. Jacob was stunned by the bequest, but Walter's lawyer explained that Walter had considered Jacob the son he never had. The ranch was to be Jacob's, with the provision that he continue to run it well and fairly. The responsibility was enormous, but Jacob rose to the challenge. With Sarah at his side, he managed the ranch successfully, treating his employees fairly and earning their loyalty and respect. The Triple Creek continued to prosper, and the Reese family with it. Sarah never forgot those desperate months before Jacob came into her life, and she made sure that no one on the ranch or in the community ever went hungry if she could help it. She organized food drives and helped families in need, always remembering what it felt like to count grain sacks and wonder if she would survive the winter. When Samuel turned 18, he announced his intention to take over the homestead and work it himself. Jacob and Sarah were both pleased and sad, pleased that their son wanted to honor the land's history, but sad to see him leave the main ranch. But they helped him prepare the homestead for his life there, repairing and improving until it was better than it had ever been. Emma surprised everyone by deciding not to become a doctor, but instead a teacher. She took over the schoolhouse in Copper Ridge and proved to be excellent at her job, patient and creative with her students. She met a young rancher from a neighboring property and married him when she was 22, and Sarah cried happy tears at her daughter's wedding. Henry, true to his wild nature, announced at 16 that he wanted to be a cowboy and see the world. Jacob tried to convince him to stay and learn to run the Triple Creek, but Sarah intervened. "Let him go," she told her husband. "Let him find his own way. He will come back when he is ready." Jacob reluctantly agreed, and Henry set off to work on various ranches across the West. He wrote letters home regularly, full of adventures and misadventures, and Sarah treasured every one. As Sarah entered her late 40s, she began to slow down, her body showing the wear of years of hard work and 3 pregnancies. Jacob, now in his early 50s, developed a slight limp from an old injury, but remained strong and capable. They sat together on the porch of the main ranch house on summer evenings, watching the sun set over the land they had built together, and Sarah marveled at how blessed her life had been. "Do you remember the day you first came to the homestead?" Sarah asked one such evening. "With that mule loaded with grain and that ridiculous story about needing storage space?" Jacob laughed. "I was never a good liar. I am surprised you let me get away with it." "I was too desperate to question it too closely," Sarah admitted. "I was so frightened, Jacob. I thought I was going to starve, or freeze, or both. And then you appeared like some kind of answer to a prayer I had not even known to say." "I was the one being blessed," Jacob said seriously. "You gave me a purpose beyond just working and surviving. You gave me a family and a home, and a reason to build something lasting. I was drifting before I met you, Sarah. You anchored me." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars come out. After a while, Sarah spoke again. "When I die, I want to be buried at the homestead, next to Thomas. I loved you both, in different ways and at different times in my life. It feels right to rest between both of my husbands, both of the men who shaped who I became." Jacob tensed. "I do not want to think about you dying." "We all die eventually," Sarah said gently. "I am not planning on it happening soon. But when it does, I want you to know my wishes, and I want you to know that I do not want you to be alone. If you find someone else after I am gone, someone who can give you comfort and companionship, I want you to do that. Do not spend your remaining years alone out of some misguided sense of loyalty to me." "There could never be anyone else," Jacob said firmly. "You are it for me, Sarah. You are my one and only." Sarah squeezed his hand, but did not argue. She hoped he was wrong, hoped that he would not suffer the loneliness she had felt after Thomas died, but she also understood the sentiment because she felt the same way. Jacob was her great love, the man who had saved her life and then made that life worth living. Henry returned home when Sarah was 52, now a man of 23, weathered and more mature than when he had left. He had stories to tell and had learned hard lessons about life and work and what mattered most. He told his parents he was ready to settle down and help run the Triple Creek, and Jacob welcomed him back with tears in his eyes and a bear hug that left Henry gasping. Samuel married a girl from town and brought her to live at the homestead. Within a year, Sarah was a grandmother, and she delighted in the role. She spent hours with Samuel's daughter, telling her stories and teaching her to cook and can. Emma had 2 children of her own, and Henry eventually married a woman he had met during his travels, bringing her back to the ranch to start their own family. Sarah lived to see all of her grandchildren grow, to hold great-grandchildren in her arms. She and Jacob grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their bodies slowing, but their love remaining constant. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and Sarah looked around at all of those faces and knew that this was what she had survived for. All of this love and life had sprung from that terrible winter, when she had been rationing grain and wondering if she would live to see spring. Jacob died first, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 78. Sarah was 75, and losing him tore a hole in her heart that never fully healed. But she had her family around her, and she took comfort in knowing that Jacob had lived a long, happy life filled with purpose and love. She made sure he was buried with full honors, and the entire community turned out to pay their respects to the man who had been so respected and loved. Sarah lived another 3 years after Jacob's death. She spent those years at the homestead, cared for by Samuel and his family, surrounded by the land that had been the beginning of everything. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about the cowboy who had filled her barn without asking why, about how love could find you even in your darkest hour, about how kindness and generosity could change the course of a life. When Sarah died at 78, peacefully and without pain, her family buried her at the homestead as she had requested. Her grave was placed between Thomas's and a space that had been reserved for Jacob. They moved Jacob's body to lie beside her, so she rested between her 2 husbands, both of whom she had loved deeply and well. On her gravestone, At the request of her children, they carved a simple inscription beneath her name and dates. She rationed grain to survive the winter. He filled her barn and her heart. Together, they built a legacy of love. The homestead remained in the family for generations, passed down through Samuel's line. The barn where Jacob had once stacked sacks of grain still stood, and the story of Sarah and Jacob's love was told and retold, becoming part of the family's history and identity. The Triple Creek Ranch thrived under the management of Henry's descendants, remaining one of the most successful operations in Montana. The grain that Jacob brought that terrible winter had saved Sarah's life, but it was his love that had truly sustained her, and that love rippled outward through time, affecting countless lives, creating a family and a community built on the foundation of one cowboy's kindness and one widow's courage to let herself hope again. In the end, that was the true legacy they left behind. Not land or wealth, but love, enduring and transformative, passed down through the generations like the most precious inheritance imaginable. Their story became a legend in Copper Ridge, told to young couples starting out, to widows facing lonely futures, to anyone who needed to believe that love could find you when you least expected it, that kindness mattered, that one person's compassion could change everything. And in that way, Sarah and Jacob lived on. Not just in the blood of their descendants, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who heard their story and believed, as Sarah had learned to believe, that even in the darkest winter, spring would come again.